Hello, this is David Marler again from Rotterdam University of Applied Sciences College of Education, and today we're going to be talking about the British class system. And before we begin, we have to think about what class is. So I want you to take a moment, pause the video, and write down what you think makes a social class, and how you can define class. Now, social class can be defined in many different ways. Really, it's a form of self-identity within a larger society. So one of the ways that we in a modern capitalistic society look at ourselves is based upon us, ourselves, people in our families, and the larger people around us. And it's a form of identity that's very important. Now, groups in social class are frequently classified and studied together as an economic status. Because we live in a society that's based upon money, it means that we look at class as being an economic construct. And that means that we look at groups as being richer or poorer, for example. And each group can be said to have particular styles of lifestyle, particular types of housing, dress, accents, etc. Now, in certain countries, for instance, like the UK, class knowledge or class self-identification is really high. In other countries, for instance, like the United States, class identity or class knowledge, the knowledge of what class you actually belong to, is very low. So I want you to take a moment and think about what class you belong to. And for instance, in the Netherlands, what types of classes does the country have? Does it have 2? Does it have 3? Does it have 5? 90% of Brits can very accurately say what class they actually belong to, and only 10% do not know. Now, in the UK, we look at 3 different classes. We have the upper, the middle, and the lower class, and this is actually quite new. For instance, Marx is often credited with the idea that modern capitalist societies only have 2 classes. The largest class he called the proletariat, or working class. These were the people that didn't have the means of production. And he had a small class that he called the bourgeoisie, or the capital class, and this was the class that controlled, for instance, land or the factories. They owned the means of production. Now, economists and sociologists actually like to think of classes in 5s. So, for instance, the upper class, the higher middle class, or the upper middle class, the middle class, the lower working class, and sometimes you can even have the working class or the unskilled laborers. Here in the UK, we would look at classes as in being upper, higher middle, lower middle, skilled working, unskilled, or semi-skilled working, and then the underclass, or people who are not falling under the constructs, people living in poverty. Recently, in the Daily Mail, they came with this graphic right here for British people to see which group they actually belong to. One of the things that you see that is most striking is that it's based upon the work that you do. Often the work that someone has, their profession, defines which class they're in. So people who went to university, who, for instance, are chief executives, bankers, or dentists, these people are part of the elite. You can see here that you even see what they like: classical music, jazz, art. They live in London or in the home counties, and they talk primarily to each other, and they're about 6% of the population. We then see, for instance, what they call the technical middle class, which are people that are, pilots, pharmacists that earn around £37,000 a year. They live in the suburbs. And we have, for instance, the established middle class, which are town planners, police, midwives, etc., live in the suburbs and rural areas. We have the new affluent, which are sales and engineers. We have the traditional working class, which has secretaries, lorry drivers, and electricians. The emergent services, which is, of course, a new class. These are people that work in restaurants or in the service industry and generally earn a lot less. And we then have the low class, people earning around £8,000 a year. Now, we can characterize these different social classes in the UK based upon a few aspects. Income is one of them. Occupation, we talked about the jobs that they do, whether or not they own land and property. Also things like lifestyle, what they like, what they do in their spare time. But a few important ones that we're going to talk about are education and accent and dialect. Now, one of the major aspects of education and the role that education plays in class has to do with this old boy network, which is a series of private schools that are often called public schools. However, they are not public, but they do service the very wealthy and aristocratic elite of the UK. Now, the major secondary school that's most popular is Eton, internationally renowned, one of the best schools in the world. However, if you look at the amount of prime ministers that have attended Eton recently in the 20th century, it's quite shocking to see that there are very few people in the country that from a very young age have the ability to gain social mobility, to be in charge of the country. A lot of these graduates of Eton go to Oxford and Cambridge universities, which are very large and very prestigious universities, which often are only comprised of the upper classes. Now, another aspect is language and social class. So the type of English that is most prevalently taught in the Netherlands is RP, or received pronunciation. You've discussed this in your linguistics classes. Now, this is a non-regional accent associated with the upper class or the upper middle class. And it's also called BBC English and sometimes the Queen's English, even though this can be left up to debate because there are aspects of the true upper or aristocratic class that are different from RP. Now, these days, there's been much greater appreciation for non-RP accents. So, for instance, someone who has a Mancunian accent or someone who comes from, let's say, Cornwall, that they don't necessarily have to learn RP to gain access to the upper middle classes. Now, this is also something that plays a role in many countries. So, for instance, in Dutch, we have ABN, Algemeen Beschaafd Nederlands, and the idea is whether or not this is necessary for television. Even in the Netherlands, you see newscasters on the NOS speaking more often with regional accents from the south or east of the country. Language and social class play an important role. Often, the way that someone speaks allows us to understand what class that person comes from, and most likely also what jobs they have. George Bernard Shaw wrote that it's impossible for an Englishman to open his mouth without making some other Englishman hate or despise him. And this is based on the idea of accentism. So how can you tell, or how do you discriminate against people based upon the way that they talk? So if we look at the lower classes, or the working classes in the UK, there are a few aspects that make their language special. One of them is the glottal stop. The glottal stop is, of course, when you stop the word around the same place that you make an H. So you would say the water's in the bottle. I, as an American, of course, turn the T in water into a D, but it'd be a water. And then, of course, in working class English, the T goes away in water and bottle, and it becomes the water's in the bottle. So water and bottle, you can hear that you're stopping that in the back of your throat. Another aspect is dropping the H in a word. So, for instance, instead of saying his head hurts, it becomes is ed hurts. And the thorn or the leanness TH noise often becomes a V. So, and it becomes an F at the end of the word. So, for instance, my brother becomes my brother. And then if you want to say moths, you would say moths. So my brother eats little moths is then how we can add all of these rules in and see typical or stereotypical working class accents. However, this isn't always the case. There's also different vocabulary, ironically enough, between, for instance, the upper and the middle classes in the UK. And the thing that's most astonishing is that it isn't what we would normally expect it to be, because we associate the upper class with sophistication. So let's look at these 5 examples right here, and I want you to pause the video after we've discussed them and ask yourself, what would someone from the upper class say and what would someone from the lower class say? So the first one is, when talking about furniture, would you use the word settee or couch? Number 2 is, if you can't hear someone properly, would you say sorry or pardon? Number 3 is, when visiting someone, would you ask them where's the toilet or where's the loo? Number 4 is, what do you call sweet, a sweet course or a sweet dessert at the end of a meal? Would you call it sweets or pudding? And number 5 is, what do you call a piece of cloth you use at the dinner table to wipe your mouth? Would you call it a serviette or a napkin? So pause this video right now and decide which one would be typical of the upper class and which one would be typical of the middle class. Now here are the answers. When you're talking about furniture, someone from the upper class would call it a couch, and someone from the middle class would call it a settee. If you can't hear someone properly, someone from the upper class would say sorry, whereas someone from the middle class would say pardon. When you're visiting someone, someone from the upper class would say, where's the toilet? Or sorry, where's the loo? Whereas someone from the middle class would say, where's the toilet? The dessert at the end of a meal would be called a pudding if you're from the upper class, and it would be called sweets if you're from the middle class. What do you call a piece of cloth you use at the end of eating on the dinner table? Someone from the middle class would call it a serviette, whereas someone from the upper class would call it a napkin. So if we look at here, couch, sorry, loo, pudding, and napkin, these seem like very plain Germanic, simple English words. However, these are common of the upper class. A characteristic of the middle class in British English is to use these more fancy, often French or Latinized words. And this has a deep history because if we consider it, it was part of the middle class during the Industrial Revolution that was being created. There was a need to emulate the upper class, and one of those ideas was to consider words, and use very sophisticated and fancy words. This is often the reason why, in English, when you call someone bourgeois, that it's an insult because you're actually saying that you're part of this new middle class that's trying to place a lot of importance on superfluous or sophisticated language that's really unnecessary, because the upper class, ironically, will generally use a much simpler word. Now, class in Britain today is still very important for a few reasons. One of them is that class is often linked with things like good health. So people that are in the upper middle classes and higher classes generally live longer. It's a predictor of success at school. Even in the Netherlands, this is the case. The higher your social class, the more likely you will be able to go to university. If you're teaching, for instance, in VWO, you go in and you ask the students how many of your parents did VWO or have attended HBO or university. Most of them are going to say that they have. Social mobility, which is the way for people within Britain to move up in the social scale, is often based upon your own class or maybe a class adjacent to yours. So it's very low. And in the House of Lords, for instance, there are still 92 peers who got their position just because of the family that they were born into. These are called the Lords Hereditary, so hereditary, that they have inherited it, erfelijk. Now, in the House of Lords, this comes from a very old system, and it originally included hereditary peers, which are dukes, earls, viscounts, and barons. And we have to remember that the House of Lords is like the Dutch Senate, so they do have a function where they review laws. The House of Lords Act in 1999 changed this. Nowadays, most lords or peers are appointed on the advice of the Prime Minister. These are called life peers, and these are people that often hold an important part in society. For instance, old prime ministers. Maggie Thatcher was one of them. And now there are only 92 hereditary peers, or people who inherited their peership because they are part of a large aristocratic family. Now, this system was introduced by William the Conqueror when he brought feudalism with him into Europe. In medieval times, society was based on a top-down hierarchy with the king at the top, followed by the nobility, so these were earls, lords, princes, dukes, etc., who owned large areas of land. They, of course, paid taxes to the king, and that is how the king received his money. Below the nobility were less prestigious groups such as local landowners or knights. And at the bottom of this structure were the peasants, who made up the overwhelming part of society. In reality, this triangle doesn't really do justice to the actual distribution of people, because it still makes it seem like 75% of the population is in, of course, the knights or vassals, nobles, and king. However, they were definitely part of the 1%. So these people that were in the peasants, they only had the right to work the land, and in order to work the land, they had to then pay a large part of taxes to the people in the higher part of the pyramid. It is in itself a pyramid scheme. But British identity isn't always based on class. British identity is also based on other factors. For instance, the four nations, gender identifications, differences in age, politics, the Brexit being a large one, religion, and ethnicities. And there are different symbols here that we have that often define the difference between the two. Now, one of the large ones that I want to talk about right now is class identity and Brexit. And the Brexit has left the UK as very much a divided nation. Because if we look at Britain, 51% of the population voted to leave and 48% voted to remain. However, in the individual countries, for instance, Scotland, only 38% voted to leave and 62% voted to remain. And something very similar also happened in Northern Ireland, where the Brexit plays an important role in the peace process. Now, when we look at social class, there was a survey that was done by Ipsos after the Brexit vote, and there was a lot of interesting information about class and the role that it played in people voting. Now, there were two main factors that they considered. First was class, and then the second one was age and sex, age and gender. So younger or more middle class people, more educated for instance, voters chose to remain, and older working class or less educated and generally white voters opted for leaving. Within each age group, the middle classes were always more likely to remain and the working classes were more likely to leave. And within each class, younger people were more likely to remain and older people were more likely to leave. So people who had jobs, whether it was full or part-time and whether it was in the private or the public sector, students, mortgage holders, and private renters almost always voted to remain. However, people who were unemployed, people who did not have mortgages or who were renting from the government, these were often people that often voted to leave. So we can see here that class and identity played a large role in whether you wanted to remain in the European Union or not. And this says a lot about the social structure within the UK. Now, I'd like you to take a moment really quickly to look at the key terms that were not discussed in this lecture and to make sure that you review those in the chapter in your book, Chapter 2. Thank you very much. Have a good day.